World War I wasn't just about an assassination, it was the collision of old empires, new ambitions, and a world teetering on the edge of chaos. The murder of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo was the match, but the firestorm that followed had been building for decades. Beneath the surface, Europe was a financial event waiting to happen. Rival nations were locked in a frantic arms race, borrowing vast sums to fund ever larger armies and navies. Banks, both national and private, became the silent engines driving this escalation, fueling the ambitions of kings and ministers alike. The assassination was the spark, but the world was already a tinderbox soaked in money and debt. Alliances crisscrossed the continent, each nation entangled in obligations, military, political, and most of all financial. The markets trembled as rumors of war spread, and the fate of millions was quietly decided in boardrooms and counting houses. Tonight, we reveal how the Great War was engineered not just by generals and politicians, but by international bankers whose influence shaped the very course of history. This is a story of power, profit, and the hidden hands that set the world ablaze. A story still relevant today, as the echoes of 1914 continue to shape our world. The assassination in Sarajevo is often remembered as the spark that ignited World War I, but the truth is far more complex and deeply rooted. The gunshot that killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand was not the true beginning of the conflict. Instead, it was merely the final straw in a system already primed for disaster. A system built on decades of political tension, economic rivalry, and, most importantly, financial entanglement. Beneath the surface, it was the financial system that set the stage for war. Decades before the first shots were fired, Europe's great powers were entangled in a web of loans, credits, and mounting debts. Banks, not bullets, were the real architects of the coming storm. The Rothschilds, for example, had branches in London, Paris, Vienna, and Berlin, facilitating massive loans to governments and influencing national policies. The House of Morgan in the United States extended credit to European powers, further intertwining the fate of nations with the interests of international finance. For years, European nations built vast armies and stockpiled weapons, all funded by mountains of debt. International bankers eagerly provided the capital, knowing that military spending meant lucrative returns. The continent's leaders became dependent on these financiers, who quietly pulled the strings from behind the scenes. In Germany, the Deutsche Bank and Diskontogesellschaft financed the expansion of the Kaiser's navy, while in France, Crédit Lyonnais and Banque de Paris et des Pays-Bas underwrote government bonds to fund new artillery and fortifications. These bankers, loyal only to their balance sheets, profited from every rising tension and every new arms contract. Their fortunes grew as nations armed themselves, and their influence seeped into the highest levels of government. In Britain, the City of London's financial elite lobbied for increased naval spending, while in Austria-Hungary, financiers pressured politicians to secure new loans for military modernization. The interests of the banking sector and the state became inseparable. Nations became clients, armies were treated as assets, and alliances were little more than financial agreements. The fate of millions was decided in boardrooms, not on battlefields. The Franco-Russian alliance, for instance, was cemented not just by mutual distrust of Germany, but by massive French loans to Russia, which funded the construction of railways and armaments. These financial ties made it nearly impossible for countries to back down without risking economic collapse. This wasn't a shadowy conspiracy, it was simply business as usual. The pursuit of profit drove decisions that would ultimately plunge the world into chaos. Bankers and industrialists saw war as an opportunity, an event that would drive up demand for steel, coal, and munitions, all of which were heavily financed by the same institutions that underwrote government debt. The system itself made war inevitable. It was not a single act of violence, but the relentless pressure of financial interests that pushed Europe over the edge. As nations mobilized, the need for more loans and resources only increased, creating a feedback loop where preparation for war made actual conflict more likely. Bankers didn't just fund the war. Their intricate network of loans and investments created the very conditions that made conflict unavoidable. In the flow of money-shaped alliances, fueled rivalries, and ensured that peace was always just out of reach. When Austria-Hungary sought German support after the assassination, it was not just military backing they needed, but financial guarantees to sustain a prolonged conflict. As arms manufacturers' stocks soared and factories churned out weapons, the financial system thrived on the promise of war. Every escalation meant more profit, and every diplomatic failure was another opportunity for gain. The arms race between Britain and Germany, for example, was not just a matter of national pride, but a lucrative business for financiers and industrialists on both sides. In the end, it wasn't a single bullet that triggered World War I, but the relentless logic of capital. A system designed to profit from conflict, no matter the human cost. The hidden triggers behind the war were not just political assassinations or diplomatic blunders, but the deep, invisible currents of finance that bound nations together in a deadly embrace. The banker's invisible hand guided Europe toward catastrophe, making war not just possible, but inevitable. Europe in the early 1900s was a continent on the brink of transformation. The streets of London, Paris, and Berlin bustled with innovation and ambition. Electric trams rattled past horse-drawn carriages, and new factories belched smoke into the sky. Beneath this surface of progress, however, lay deep and growing financial vulnerabilities. The grand boulevards and busy marketplaces masked a mounting sense of unease, as nations raced to modernize, industrialize, and expand their empires in a contest that was as much economic as it was political. Behind the scenes, a vast and tangled web of indebted corporations stretched across borders. Railways, steelworks, and shipping companies borrowed heavily to fuel expansion, their fortunes tied to the unpredictable tides of global markets and the decisions of powerful financiers. By 1913, European companies owed billions of pounds, an astronomical sum for the era, much of it borrowed from banks in London, Paris, and Berlin. Major powers like Britain, France, and Germany were drowning in debt. By 1914, Britain's national debt had reached over $700 million, while France and Germany each owed hundreds of millions more. Their governments and industries were propped up by vast loans from merchant banks such as the Rothschilds, Barings, and J.P. Morgan. These financial giants didn't just lend money, they shaped policy, influenced diplomacy, and quietly dictated the pace of progress. Their reach extended into the highest levels of government, with bankers often acting as unofficial advisors to kings, ministers, and even prime ministers. These banks operated as shadow empires, wielding influence that rivaled monarchs and ministers. Their profits soared as they financed imperial conquests, wars, and industrial expansion, often prioritizing their own interests above those of nations. In 1912 alone, British banks issued over $200 million in foreign loans, much of it to rival powers. The lines between national and private interests blurred as bankers played both sides of the geopolitical chessboard. At the heart of the system was the gold standard, a rigid framework that tied every major currency to gold reserves. This was meant to ensure stability, but in reality, it created a delicate and dangerous balance. If a country's gold reserves fell, its currency and credit could collapse overnight. The gold standard made economies vulnerable to sudden shocks, speculative attacks, and the whims of international investors. In 1913, the Bank of England held just $40 million in gold to back over $1 billion in notes and deposits, a precarious ratio that left the entire system exposed. Countries competed fiercely for gold, hoarding reserves and manipulating trade to protect their wealth. Trade deficits weren't just economic concerns, they became matters of national security, fueling suspicion and rivalry between neighbors. France, for example, amassed huge gold reserves as a buffer against Germany. While Germany sought to outpace Britain in both industry and finance, every shipment of gold, every trade imbalance, was watched with anxiety and suspicion. As national debts soared and stock exchanges grew ever more frantic, the European economy became a powder keg, volatile, interconnected, and dangerously inflexible. In 1914, the combined national debts of Britain, France, and Germany exceeded $2 billion, while stock markets in London, Paris, and Berlin saw record levels of speculation and volatility. The financial system was so tightly wound that a crisis in one country could trigger panic across the continent in a matter of hours. The clock was ticking, and all it would take was a single spark, a diplomatic crisis, a market panic, or a sudden run on gold, to ignite a continent-wide disaster. Bankers and politicians alike knew the risks, but few could imagine just how quickly the system could unravel. The financial system of pre-war Europe was a doomsday machine, primed, loaded, and waiting for the inevitable explosion. In the summer of 1914, that explosion would come, and the world would never be the same. Imperialism, often cloaked in the rhetoric of a civilizing mission, was at its core a vast business enterprise. Behind the lofty speeches about progress and enlightenment, the true engine of empire was profit. European powers, from Britain to France to Germany, saw the world as a chessboard of economic opportunity, where colonies were not just territories, but assets to be acquired, developed, and exploited for maximum financial gain. Colonies functioned as corporate subsidiaries, their primary purpose to supply raw materials: rubber from the Congo, cotton from India, gold from South Africa, feeding the insatiable factories of Europe. Local populations were often forced into labor, their lives and lands transformed into lines on a balance sheet. Colonial markets, meanwhile, became captive consumers for European manufactured goods, ensuring a steady flow of profits back to the metropole. Financing this global enterprise were international bankers, men whose names rarely appeared in history books but whose influence was immense. They provided the capital to build the ships, arm the soldiers, and lay the railways that stitched empires together. For these financiers, imperialism was less about flags and more about dividends. The logic was simple: the more colonies a nation controlled, the more resources it could extract, and the more powerful its economy became. The Industrial Revolution supercharged this process, creating a hunger for raw materials and new markets that only overseas expansion could satisfy. Every step of imperial expansion was lubricated by loans and credit from banks. These financial institutions underwrote colonial ventures, often at high interest, ensuring that both the risks and rewards of empire were shared among a select group of investors. In many cases, colonial governments became deeply indebted to the very banks that financed their conquests. Nowhere was this financial competition more evident than in the scramble for Africa. In the late 19th century, European powers raced to carve up the continent, not just for prestige, but for the vast mineral wealth and new markets it offered. Bankers, often working behind the scenes, played a pivotal role, funding expeditions, railways, and even wars to secure their share of the spoils. This economic rivalry between empires created a tinderbox of tension. As each nation sought to outdo the others in acquiring colonies and resources, diplomatic disputes and military standoffs became increasingly common, setting the stage for the global conflict that would erupt in 1914. The bankers, in many ways, were the venture capitalists of imperialism. They evaluated risks, funded new ventures, and reaped enormous profits from the expansion of empire. Their influence extended from the boardrooms of London and Paris to the jungles of Africa and the plains of Asia. When war finally came, the financial system that had fueled imperial expansion made conflict itself profitable. Banks issued war bonds, financed armies, and managed the vast flows of capital required to sustain the war effort. In the end, imperialism was not just a political or military project, it was a business, and for those who controlled the money, it was a lucrative one. Yet, the costs were borne by millions, colonized peoples, exploited workers, and ultimately, the world itself, plunged into war by the relentless pursuit of profit. By the 1910s, Europe was thick with economic paranoia. The continent's great powers, Britain, France, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Russia, were all entangled in a web of mounting debt and suspicion. The streets of London and Paris buzzed with rumors of financial collapse, while Berlin's newspapers warned of foreign plots to undermine the German economy. National debts were astronomical, fueling an arms race that seemed impossible to stop. By 1913, Britain's national debt had soared to over 700 million, while France and Germany each owed billions of marks and francs. Governments borrowed heavily to finance new dreadnoughts, artillery, and railways, convinced that falling behind would mean national ruin. Bankers, especially those in London, Paris, and Berlin, profited handsomely from the sale of government bonds and the financing of arms manufacturers. The Rothschilds, the Warburgs, and other powerful banking families acted as intermediaries, earning commissions and interest on every transaction. As historian Niall Ferguson notes, the bond market was the real battlefield of Europe before the guns began to fire. The media, often influenced by financial interests, fanned the flames of fear. Newspapers published alarming headlines about enemy mobilizations and economic sabotage, sometimes at the urging of their wealthy backers. According to economic historian Adam Tooze, the press became a megaphone for the anxieties of the financial elite. Economic anxiety made diplomacy difficult, turning trade rivalries into aggression. British and German industries competed fiercely for markets and resources, while tariffs and trade barriers multiplied. Every diplomatic crisis threatened to trigger a financial panic, as investors rushed to pull their money from foreign banks. The financial system was the engine of tension. Stock markets across Europe lurched with every diplomatic incident, and the fear of a sudden crash haunted both governments and investors. As one British banker wrote in 1912, "We are living on a volcano of credit." The bankers profited from the tension they helped create. Their influence reached into the highest levels of government, shaping policy and public opinion alike. As financial journalist Charles Conan observed, the interests of high finance and national security became inseparable. The system was a closed loop of profit. Money flowed from governments to banks, from banks to arms manufacturers, and back again, each transaction deepening the cycle of debt and suspicion. In the words of economic historian Eric Hobsbawm, Europe's fate was sealed not just by its armies but by its balance sheets. The gold standard was more than just a financial straitjacket, it was a doomsday machine, quietly ticking beneath the surface of pre-war Europe. Every nation's currency was rigidly tied to its gold reserves. This meant that the amount of money in circulation could never exceed the gold held in vaults, no matter the needs of the people or the demands of the economy. When gold flowed out of a country, perhaps to pay for imports or to settle debts, its money supply shrank. The result? Recession, unemployment, and widespread misery. Ordinary people bore the brunt of these invisible movements of gold. The system was merciless. It prioritized the value of currency over the well-being of citizens, forcing governments to cut spending and raise interest rates even as their people suffered. Central banks, run by a small circle of banking elites, held the levers of this system. They alone decided when to defend the gold standard and when to let economies collapse. The gold standard was not a law of nature, it was a man-made system. An elaborate machine designed to keep money scarce and power concentrated. This machine placed immense power in the hands of financiers. They could trigger crises or restore stability with a single decision, often behind closed doors and far from public scrutiny. In the years before World War I, the global economy was held hostage to their interests. The fate of millions depended on the whims of a few, and the doomsday machine kept ticking, waiting for the spark that would set the world ablaze. In the years leading up to World War I, alliances between nations were far more than simple political agreements. They were, in essence, financial contracts, IOUs written in ink and sealed with gold. Behind closed doors, diplomats and bankers worked hand in hand, forging secret deals that would tie the fate of empires to the flow of money. The Franco-Russian alliance, for example, was not just a military pact. It was underwritten by a series of massive French loans to Russia. French bankers poured billions of francs into Russian railways, armaments, and infrastructure, betting that a strong Russia would keep Germany in check. France's financial stability became deeply entwined with Russia's military fortunes. When Russian troops advanced or retreated, the Paris Stock Exchange trembled. French families, who had invested their savings in Russian bonds, anxiously followed every headline from the Eastern Front. Britain, too, was drawn into this web of financial commitments. The Entente Cordiale with France was reinforced by a network of loans, credits, and insurance guarantees. British financiers quietly backed French rearmament, knowing that their own fortunes were now linked to the survival of their allies. By 1914, decisions about war and peace were as much about balance sheets as about treaties. Governments weighed the cost of mobilization, the risk to their creditors, and the potential collapse of their national currencies. For the Entente powers, neutrality was not just a political impossibility, it was financial suicide. If France or Britain failed to support their allies, the value of their bonds would plummet and their banking systems could collapse overnight. These alliances were collateralized by debt. Each nation's promise to fight was backed by the hard currency of loans, bonds, and financial guarantees, turning the battlefield into a ledger of credits and debits. In the end, the financial system itself made war almost inevitable. The secret alliances, underwritten by mountains of debt, created a situation where a single spark could ignite a global conflagration, because the true cost of peace had become too high for any nation to bear. In the years leading up to World War I, Germany's economic position was far more precarious than it appeared on the surface. Despite its industrial might, Germany was financially vulnerable, its fate tightly shackled to that of Austria-Hungary. This dependence was not just political but deeply rooted in the financial systems that bound the two empires together. German banks, seeking influence and security, extended massive loans to Vienna. These funds were not just for economic development. They directly fueled Austria-Hungary's military ambitions, underwriting arms purchases and troop mobilizations. For example, in 1912, German financial institutions underwrote a significant portion of Austria-Hungary's war bond issues, effectively tying German capital to the fate of its neighbors' military ventures. Germany found itself trapped in a cycle, supporting a weaker ally to avoid diplomatic isolation. The alliance, meant to provide security, instead became a financial and strategic burden. German leaders feared that if Austria-Hungary collapsed, Germany would stand alone against hostile powers, so they propped up their partner at great cost. Austria-Hungary, aware of Germany's fear of isolation, used this leverage to push for ever more reckless actions. When Vienna demanded support for its aggressive stance against Serbia, Berlin felt compelled to comply, even as the risks mounted. The relationship became one of exploitation, with Austria-Hungary extracting guarantees and resources from its more powerful ally. The infamous blank check that Germany gave Austria-Hungary in July 1914 was not a gesture of aggression, but one of financial desperation. German leaders hoped that by offering unconditional support, they could control events and prevent a wider war. Instead, they found themselves underwriting a conflict they could not contain. The financial strain of supporting Austria-Hungary undermined Germany's own stability. As the alliance deepened, German banks became overextended, and the nation's creditworthiness suffered. The costs of propping up a faltering partner rippled through the German economy, destabilizing markets and eroding public confidence. The financial system itself became a conveyor belt, pulling both empires inexorably toward war. Every loan, every guarantee, every transfer of gold tightened the web of obligations, making it harder to step back from the brink. In the end, the debt chains binding Germany and Austria-Hungary dragged both empires toward the abyss. Financial dependence became exploitation, and exploitation became catastrophe, setting the stage for the world's first truly global war. In 1915, as Europe was engulfed in war, J.P. Morgan made a move that would alter the course of history. The United States, officially neutral, was in reality deeply entangled, thanks to Morgan's unprecedented financial maneuvering. Morgan secured exclusive rights from the British and French governments to arrange all purchases of American goods and war supplies. This wasn't just a loan, it was a vast financial pipeline, channeling billions of dollars from American banks to the Allied war effort. The initial loan, $500 million, was staggering for its time. But it was only the beginning. Morgan's syndicate funneled money, weapons and supplies across the Atlantic, binding American prosperity to Allied victory. As the financial stakes grew, so did the pressure to support the Allies. Pro-war propaganda flooded newspapers and posters, much of it quietly funded by those with the most to lose if the Allies fell. When the U.S. finally entered the war in 1917, it wasn't just a military decision, it was a financial rescue. The government's intervention guaranteed repayment of Morgan's loans and secured Wall Street's investments. The financial system, intertwined with political power, dictated the nation's path. Decisions in Washington were shaped by the urgent need to protect American capital abroad. For bankers, the war was more than a conflict, it was a business opportunity of unprecedented scale. Profits soared as the machinery of war churned. Behind the scenes, financial interests lobbied relentlessly, ensuring that American policy aligned with their investments. The push for war was as much about balance sheets as battlefields. In the end, the system profited immensely from conflict. Morgan's game-changing loan didn't just finance a war, it reshaped the global balance of power and set a precedent for the entanglement of finance and foreign policy that endures to this day. The war shattered the financial system, killing the gold standard. The pre-war era was marked by financial stability, with currencies backed by gold reserves. Governments abandoned financial discipline, printing money and borrowing. This led to unprecedented levels of national debt and a departure from the gold standard. Massive inflation wiped out savings, while a select few profited. The middle class saw their wealth evaporate, leading to widespread economic hardship. bankers managed war loans, earning commissions on transactions. These financial institutions played a crucial role in funding the war efforts, often at the expense of the general populace. The war altered the financial landscape, shifting power to the U.S. New York emerged as the new financial capital, overshadowing London. The gold standard was dead, replaced by the American dollar. This transition marked a significant shift in global economic policies. The financial system crowned a new king: Wall Street. The influence of American financial institutions grew exponentially. The war was a profitable enterprise for a tiny elite. While the masses suffered, a small group of financiers and industrialists amassed great wealth. The financial system reshaped the world. The aftermath of the war saw the emergence of new economic powers and the decline of old ones, forever altering the global financial order. The Treaty of Versailles, often remembered as the formal end to World War I, was in reality less a blueprint for peace and more a complex act of financial engineering. Behind the grand halls and diplomatic handshakes, the victors, driven by their own economic anxieties, crafted a system designed to shift the crushing burden of war onto the defeated. The treaty's architects believed that by imposing massive reparations, they could both punish Germany and stabilize their own economies, but this approach would have far-reaching and deeply destabilizing consequences that rippled across the globe. German reparations became a vast international debt collection scheme, funneling money from a devastated Germany to the Allied powers. The payments were so immense that they crippled Germany's economy, draining resources, stifling recovery, and fueling resentment among its people. The Allies, meanwhile, depended on these payments to repay their own war debts, primarily to American banks, creating a tangled web of financial dependency that left the entire system vulnerable to collapse. This cycle of debt was not just a matter of numbers on a ledger. It was a mechanism that bound nations together in mutual fragility, where the failure of one could trigger the downfall of many. The crushing reparations led to one of the most infamous episodes of economic chaos in modern history: hyperinflation in Germany. Money lost its value overnight. Ordinary citizens saw their life savings evaporate, and the once stable middle class was wiped out. The social fabric of the nation unraveled as people bartered for food, and children played with stacks of worthless banknotes. This economic devastation opened the door to political extremism, as desperate people searched for solutions and scapegoats. The seeds of radical ideologies were sown in the fertile ground of financial ruin, setting the stage for the rise of authoritarian movements that would later plunge the world into even greater conflict. The harsh financial terms of the treaty did not heal wounds, they deepened them. Instead of securing lasting peace, the treaty's economic demands planted the seeds for future conflict, as bitterness and instability grew across Europe. The sense of injustice and humiliation felt by the German people became a rallying cry for those who sought to overturn the post-war order, while the victors themselves remained trapped in a cycle of dependency on reparations that could never truly be paid. As Europe struggled under the weight of debt and economic dislocation, the United States emerged as the world's largest creditor. American banks lent vast sums to Europe, hoping to keep the system afloat and protect their own interests. This new financial dominance shifted the balance of global power, making the U.S. not just an economic powerhouse, but the linchpin of the entire international financial system. Yet this dominance came with risks. The world economy became more fragile and interconnected than ever before, with the fate of nations tied to the decisions of bankers and politicians in New York and Washington. The post-war financial order was, in many ways, a disaster waiting to happen. The system was built on unstable debts and risky loans, with little regard for the underlying economic realities of devastated nations. When cracks began to show, when Germany defaulted, when American loans dried up, the consequences were swift and devastating. The collapse of one part of the system sent shockwaves through the entire global economy, exposing the fragility of a world built on credit and speculation. In a desperate attempt to restore stability, governments tried to return to the gold standard, believing that tying currencies to gold would bring order to the chaos. Instead, this move triggered deflation and economic collapse. The rigidities of the gold standard made it impossible for countries to respond flexibly to crisis, and the result was the Great Depression, a global catastrophe that shattered lives, destroyed economies, and undermined faith in the very institutions meant to protect society. The financial architects of the era, rather than confronting the root causes of instability, deferred real solutions. They patched over problems with short-term fixes, hoping to buy time or shift the burden elsewhere. This approach set the stage for even greater disasters as the world lurched from crisis to crisis, each one more severe than the last. The lessons of Versailles and its aftermath were clear. Without genuine reform, the cycle of debt and disaster would only repeat itself. In the end, the system profited from conflict, not peace. The cycle of debt, empire, and disaster became self-perpetuating, shaping the fate of nations for decades to come. The financial interests that had engineered the post-war order found opportunity in instability, as war debts and reconstruction loans became tools of influence and control. The legacy of Versailles was not just a broken peace, but a blueprint for future crises, reminding us that when financial power is wielded without accountability, the next disaster is never far away. Today, the echoes of that era still resonate. The global financial system remains deeply interconnected, vulnerable to shocks and imbalances. The lessons of debt, empire, and disaster are as relevant now as they were a century ago. As we look to the future, the challenge is clear. To break the cycle, we must confront the underlying forces that drive instability, ensuring that the next disaster is not simply the latest chapter in an old and dangerous story. The financial origins of WWI reveal a system that thrived on human suffering and global conflict. The pursuit of profit by a financial elite had far-reaching geopolitical consequences, shaping the course of history. The system made war profitable, not peace, incentivizing conflict over diplomacy. The world today mirrors the financial system of WWI, where economic interests often overshadow humanitarian concerns. Massive government debt and a globalized financial system continue to dominate, creating a cycle of dependency and control. Military spending remains a highly profitable industry, driven by the same forces that fueled the war economy of the early 20th century. The story of WWI serves as a stark warning about the unseen forces that continue to shape our world, often to the detriment of peace and stability. To truly understand the roots of conflict, one must follow the money, tracing the financial incentives that drive nations to war. The system profits from instability, perpetuating a cycle where economic gain is prioritized over human life and global harmony. As we reflect on the past, it is crucial to recognize these patterns and advocate for a world where peace is more profitable than war. The Great War was not merely a clash of empires or a series of political miscalculations. It was, at its core, a financial project, meticulously underwritten by the world's most powerful bankers. Behind the thunder of artillery and the shifting lines on the map, a quieter battle raged in counting houses and boardrooms where fortunes were wagered and lost on the outcome of nations. If we examine the balance sheet of history, we see that wars are rarely paid for by the victors alone. Instead, they are financed by creditors, those who lend, speculate, and profit from the chaos. The debts incurred during World War I reshaped economies, toppled governments, and left entire populations burdened for generations. Yet, while borders changed and empires fell, the financial system endured, adapting and evolving, always finding new ways to profit from conflict and reconstruction alike. Today, the legacy of those secret deals and shadowy transactions still echoes in our global economy. The same institutions that once bankrolled the war continue to shape our world, influencing policy, steering markets, and at times, fueling new crises. As we reflect on the true cost of the Great War, we must ask, who really pays and who truly profits? The balance sheet of history is not just measured in lives lost or treaties signed, but in the enduring power of those who control the flow of money, reminding us that in the end, history is written not only by the victors, but by the creditors who finance their triumphs and tragedies.